All right, so you're a dad.
Yep.
I'm a dad.
Yep.
Let's read dad jokes to each
Okay.
other. First person to laugh loses.
All
All right?
do it.
Okay, here we
first.
go. Okay, I got mine. Okay. A ham sandwich walks into a bar and orders a beer. Bartender says, "Sorry, we don't serve food here." I don't get that one.
Whenever the cashier at the grocery store asks my dad if he would like a milk in a bag, he replies, "No, just leave it in the carton."
Why do chicken coops only have 2 doors? Because if they had 4, they would be chicken sedans.
Dad, make me a sandwich. Poof, you're a sandwich.
Hello and welcome to Community Group Curriculum this week. I feel like I could just cut that out from old ones and put that back in. I say that every time the exact same way.
You could.
I've actually thought of switching it up, and I physically
No,
cannot.
don't do it. Don't do it.
No, like
It's
I
a
actually
staple.
can't. I've
You
tried.
can't.
I've tried
Okay.
to say it different ways. It comes out that one way. That's it. My name is Chris. This is Victor Maynard, and we're excited to have you guys here today. Hope you've had an awesome week so far. Let's jump in to Matthew 18 because there are some really hard things and some cool perspectives that we gained from this text.
yeah.
Like it's really turned a lot of ideas on their head, given a lot of responsibility to us as a church, and also a better understanding of who God is and how we can relate to Him. So we're going to talk about those things today. But first, if you want to read this with me, it's chapter 18, verse 18. Make it simple. Let's read that now. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. This is Jesus talking, if you don't know. And whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. This is the idea that there is an extension beyond our mere mortality than things that are going on in our life. I mean, a lot of us will say, hey, you gotta live for the moment, or you gotta live in the moment. I think that's the better one of the two.
Yeah.
Live in the moment, not for the moment.
Yeah.
But we try and we gotta make decisions now that impact us now and engage with the now. I think there's some importance in that, but also understand there's a responsibility that plays beyond the time that we're in right now. That it's saying what Jesus is saying right here is there's responsibility that goes on for eternity.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that are happening and importance that's happening that happens in our decisions in our day-to-day in the lives that we're making now that actually can play off for all of eternity and time.
Yeah, and I think especially in some theological circles, we have maybe an overemphasis of the sovereignty of God, where God's just going to do what He's going to do, and we don't really have any say in that. At the end of the day, He's going to win. We know the last chapter,
right?
And so there's kind of this apathy that comes with that, where we're I don't really need to pray, I don't really need to evangelize, I don't really need to feed the poor, whatever, because we already know what's going to happen. But in this text, Jesus is clearly saying, no, don't have that attitude, don't have that posture, because what you do now actually has a drastic impact in eternity. And you should feel the weight of that, I think.
Yeah, I think there's definitely responsibility that comes with even when people talk about that, the sovereignty of God. It's true that God is in control and that God does make His plans and God will have His way with or without us. And yet there's something beautiful about what God does. He gives us responsibility. He gives us a role to play in all of eternity and things that are going on, that He actually asks us to be part of what He's doing, that God uses His people to achieve His mission in the world. And that's something He's inviting us to gladly and that we should actually be willing to accept. And I think sometimes what we do is we shy away from responsibility. Honestly, if we even the idea of, let's say a kid, right? You have 18 years, let's put that on a bookshelf of this is the time you get with your kid to raise them into an adult, and that's it. And that's a big responsibility. But what this is saying is there's eternal responsibility in what you do all the time, that there are souls in the balance, there are things that you will actually have an impact on for the rest of time. So here's my question to you guys. What are ways that in your life that you've avoided responsibility because maybe you've been scared of it? What are things that you feel called to take responsibility in? And have you ever thought about this? Have you ever thought that maybe your actions, the things that you do, might actually impact all of eternity? I mean, because these are big questions. And it's not to wear it as a weight of oh man, if I screw up, all of eternity is completely hooped. I've just completely screwed all of eternity in this moment. Because we have to understand that God is sovereign, but He allows us to play a role and gives us responsibility as His children. He has things that He wants us to achieve and accomplish. And there's something about being faithful in that. And we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when it feels like I've been doing all this responsibility, working so hard of it in vain. We'll talk about that next. But right now, I just want to discuss what does it look like to have responsibility in your life, knowing that it could affect eternity? Is there things that you shied away from? What does that look like in your life? Let's discuss that as a group right now. If we were to read 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58, so all the way at the end of that, right before 16, this is what Paul says in this letter. He says, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, and always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." That there's something going on here where we might labor, we might try. There's a lot of times in our life where we put a lot of work into something, and maybe you've had this experience, I know I have, where we've put a ton of work into something really important that we've poured ourselves into, hours and hours and time and money and resources, and it all seems to go to waste. Maybe that's a relationship that you've been like trying really hard for this person to come to know Jesus and loving them and spending time with them and inviting them over, and then they just disappear, and you've kind of followed up with them and wonder where they were, and it feels like maybe there was like almost no relationship there to begin with, or there may as well have not have been, because there's no response, there's no outcome, there's no benefit. When we read this and we say your labor is not in vain, that knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain, your prayers are not in vain, your money that you spent on this is not in vain, there's all these things that we might say, wow, what a waste, because we don't like the outcome, and yet Paul here is saying that it's not in vain, that there's something significant that's happened there. It makes me wonder if maybe the pursuit is more important than the actual end of what sometimes we actually seem to accomplish or seek to accomplish.
Yeah, I really truly believe that we're probably aware of maybe 1 out of 5 things God is doing in us and through us, and especially in the area of prayer. For me personally, I know for prayer, especially petition prayer, when I'm asking God for things, a lot of times what happens at the very least is I begin to build a passion or a sympathy for the thing I'm praying for. So what's happening is I'm asking for something to be changed, and what's most of the time what's happening is actually I'm the person being changed through that. I'm actually finding myself I have to rely on God more, or I actually get a bigger burden for what I'm praying for, and it actually weighs on me, and I want to actually move and act in a different way towards that thing. And so there's something always happening. There's this mysterious thing happening behind the scenes that we have to honestly just trust that God is doing something profound that we don't always see. And I think we'll enter into heaven one day with a handful of why did that happen, and that's a good thing, that God is working behind the scenes, and we have to respect that, and we have to trust Him in that.
Yeah, totally. And that's where this comes down to trust. Like, do we trust well that what we're doing is not in vain? You know, even when sometimes it feels like it's hard, even when it feels like it's uphill, like, what is the point of this, we might ask, right? Or those whys, like, I've been praying for this forever and it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. And when we go into chapter 18, it talks about how when 2 or 3 are gathered, and like, it will be done, and you know, like, it's one of these hard verses that we struggle with, and we'll get into the hermeneutics of that and how Mark discussed that, how, you know, it opens up into, are we reading our Bibles well to really understand what Jesus is saying and the context in which He's saying it, so that we're not filling our hearts and minds with ideas that may not be even fully biblical, right? But what this makes me think, the idea of just knowing that the work that we do is not in vain, the prayers that you do are not in vain, the time that you spend with people is not in vain. We won't see the outcome of everything we do. And I hear stories all the time, actually. It's interesting. I'll sit down with people who will come in and tell me stories, and I'll ask them, what was your story? And they'll have this moment where there was a person in their life who changed something along the way. And they'll always be able to name that person who stepped in, or that person who said something, or that moment I went to this church and this person said that. And I said, well, have you ever gone back to that person now as like a mature Christian and talked to them and said, thank you? Like, you may not know what you did, but you've actually encouraged me in this way. You are the reason, you know, by God's grace, that helped me to actually step out of whatever I was dealing with. When you said this helped me. I think that's just such a great encouragement. So if you have ever had that moment, would you consider even just going to that person, maybe that you haven't seen, where it's like, man, I had this one Sunday school teacher 15 years ago who said this thing, and I never had a chance to thank them or tell them, or they don't see what they did in my life, they don't know. I think that would be such an encouragement, because you're right. Sometimes we need to know and be reminded that our labor is not in vain, that there are things that we're doing for the Lord that may feel like it, but they're not. That God is if we're being faithful to what God's calling us to, then that's a very important piece to it. And yes, effectiveness and strategy and everything's important too. But let's discuss this. What does it mean to actually labor? Have you ever felt that way? We've been laboring in vain. What does it look like even to be praying to a place where it feels like it's in vain? Is God answering? What happens when He doesn't? Well, let's discuss these things as a group right now. In the book of Exodus, chapter 3, there's this moment where God is actually engaging with Moses as a burning bush, and Moses comes in and he says, well, who am I supposed to actually... Let me read it for you guys so you guys can hear it, okay? This is verse 13, starting in verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your father sent me to you, and they ask me, what is His name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And He said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. You see, there's a beautiful piece where God actually allows himself to be named. Something goes on when you know someone's name. It means you can actually call to them, that there's a personability there where you can actually engage with them. They're personal, and you can talk with them and call them in times of help, right? In need. It's like, man, there's a baby could cry and cry and cry, but once a baby knows to say mama, now it's crying for something specific. It's crying out for help. And what happens here in this moment is like God has actually given a name to his people for them to call out upon, for them to identify, for them to actually call for, because our God is a God who walks with his people. And if you haven't read through the story of Exodus, it's a beautiful story of God redeeming and freeing a group of people. And it's something that you should definitely do to engage with. And I think there's so many theological points that come from this example of God walking so closely with his people and engaging with them. And it's a beautiful thing where we get to know the character of God through that story. Through our lives, though, I feel like sometimes we forget that God is actually that intimate and that close with us. We forget that he's with us. We get scared, or we wonder, or we think he's far from us. We're on a flight and things get scary and turbulent. We're wondering, oh my goodness, like what's going to happen in the situation, forgetting that God is with us and sovereign over that situation. Or we're in life and we get something that happens in our life where we find that we have a disease that we never intended to have, that we intended and viewed our life to be so many more years full, and yet it seems to be cutting short. And we say, well, God, where are you in that? I feel lost and I feel turmoil and I feel scared and anxious about everything that's going on. Or our kids start going off the rails and we're saying, well, God, where are you in this? Or we lose our job and like it's been very secure for a long time, and then something happens, and again, God, where are you? We're always asking that question, where are you, God? We see the pain and suffering in the world. Where are you, God? What God is showing us in this moment, and also what he's telling us in Matthew chapter 18, where he's saying, I'm with you, that he's a God who's actually intimate with his people, that he's a God who's actually close enough by that he can be called upon by name, that when you cry out to God, that he will actually be there with you. And post Jesus' death and resurrection, we're adopted into his family as children, and it's a way that we can actually call upon him as Father, Abba, that it's even more intimate than I am who I am, but it's actually saying that I am a father to you, that I'm close, that I can be cried upon, I can be called into, and in that situation.
Yeah, I think there's something about familiarity where we think, of course, God is personal, of course he's with us, but we got to understand he never had to be. He never had to actually step into this world. He never had to speak and show his presence in a way. The only thing he really owed us was judging us for our sin. That's the only thing he really needed to interact with us on, but he decided not to. He decided to actually come down and come and invest into a world that needed him. And so we have to remind ourselves that we have this beautiful privilege that no other religion really is offering of this very personable, relatable, and intimate God. And that should be something that we're grateful and thankful for, and remind ourselves of how good that is, and just don't always assume that this is something we're entitled to or deserve, or of course we have access to God. It's like, no, this is a beautiful privilege of God deciding, making this clear decision to come into a messy and sinful world.
And the very fact that we even have the example of Jesus to look into, to see God in human form, like being and living and acting and loving and saving and healing and like everything that he did, where we saw his character. I mean, that's something where, again, we can even more intimately know who he is and who we cry upon. That's a beautiful thing. But in reality, it's true, we forget, we don't know, we don't remember, or it becomes a novelty. Oh, God's with you. Okay. Oh, God has a plan. Okay, what does that mean? Doesn't seem to help. In a very real way, let's discuss what that means for you in your life. I mean, are there moments where you haven't felt, or maybe you're not feeling God close at all right now? Maybe you're having trouble believing in him, or even knowing that he's with you and with you guys right now in your groups. Let's discuss that right now as groups. What does it mean to know that God is with you? How are you reminded regularly that God is with you? Have you ever felt moments where it doesn't feel like he's close at all?
Right.
What's that been like for you? Let's discuss that as groups right now.